psychological manipulation by the other parent. We're a volunteer group which receives no funding, and our details and all about us can be found at alienated.ie, along with links to other videos and hopefully helpful YouTube explanations about things as well. So alienated.ie for those details. Our fundamental objective is to raise awareness on parental alienation abuse, and therein to educate the judiciary, legal professionals and psychological professionals around the world, legislators, and also hopefully to help targeted parents of the abuse as to what can be done to stop this particularly insidious form of child abuse. Parental alienation is also a clear form of spousal abuse, which a lot of people don't quite recognize just yet, particularly our police forces. But ultimately what we have is a situation where children are being weaponized to injure a spouse, and therefore it is most certainly a form of domestic violence, therefore. A recent webinar of ours heard from Dr. Craig Childress, and he explained that the lifelong effects of parental alienation abuse are identical to those of sexual abuse of a child. So it will give you an indication as to just how serious this is in terms of the effects it has on our children. The sort of things you typically will see are an inability to carry out normal loving relations, a lack of trust, and this manifests often as premature sexual activity, drug and alcohol abuse, self-harming, and sadly all too often even suicide. The perpetrators are equally men and women, many of whom are victims themselves. The cycle needs to have a spanner put in the wheel, and that's what we're all about here. We at alienated.ie abhor all forms of abuse, including false allegations of parental alienation, which is a big one because there are lots of those too. We abhor domestic violence of any sort, both against both genders, and especially the voiceless children, sadly, some of whom never end up reunited with parents that love them in breach of their constitutional rights to have access to both parents. So we are presenting you with a series of these webinars, presenting top academics from universities around the world and professional bodies in order that the true, authentic voice of the child can be heard. There are many names, firstly, for parental alienation, such as pathological parenting, parentectomy. The term parental alienation itself, however, is not a medical definition. It is an urban description of a series of behaviors which are all tantamount to abuse. It is undoubtedly child abuse, and it is spousal abuse, aka domestic violence, as I mentioned earlier. Health providers, Irish and international case law recognizes this abuse by a set of behaviors which are the result of emotional or coercive control, manipulation of trusting children. And you can find out further details at alienated.ie. Today, however, we have something positive to offer on this subject. The presence of Dr. Jennifer Harman. Jennifer was a family and substance abuse counselor for years prior to her entry into academia, obtaining her PhD in social psychology in 2005. Dr. Harman specializes in the study of intimate relationships and is currently associate professor of psychology at Colorado State University in the United States. Dr. Harman's areas of research expertise focus on the topic of power in relationships, power in how intimate partners influence each other for good or for bad. Her work has applied social psychological theories on intimate relations to the study of public health problems, ranging from STI prevention to domestic violence, about which we spoke earlier. Dr. Harman is an accomplished and awarded scientist and lecturer. She has many published peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and presents her research regularly at scientific conferences around the world. Most recently, I think Dr. Harman was at the conference in Malta. Aside from her professional publications, Dr. Harman also writes articles for general audiences such as The Conversation, and her work is republished on thousands of other news sites, for example, Associated Press, Raw Story, etc. And her TEDx talk has received many, many thousands of views, and you can find that on YouTube. It's still there. So Dr. Harman regularly conducts training for legal and mental professionals on parental alienation, as she is kindly doing for us here today, and has served as an expert witness and consultant on civil and criminal cases involving parental alienation and other forms of family violence. Today, we at alienatedchildren.ie are delighted to welcome Dr. Jennifer Harman. Hi, Doctor.
Oh, hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you, and thank you so much for volunteering your time to help us with this major, what seems to be another international pandemic.
Yeah, it most definitely is. It's not something that's culturally specific or regionally specific. It's global.
And is it something that has just started recently, or that we have just recently become aware of and been able to put a label on?
No, it's been around a long time. In fact, there's case law from, England from several hundred years ago. They just didn't have the same words for it, but they were describing exactly the same behaviors of parents who turn a child against another parent. It's gone by many different names, and I don't care what you call it. You can call it, chicken noodle soup for all I care. It's the same behaviors that parents are doing time and again to hurt a child by turning them against another parent. So it's nothing new.
Do you think, Jennifer, that they actually realize they are hurting a child by weaponizing the child against another parent?
I'd hope not. I hope that they're not aware that that's what they're doing, because then that would imply that they are really, really heartless and don't care. I mean, I think there's a lot of variability in people's awareness of why they do things. I think the people who are engaging in very severe alienating behaviors, in my opinion, I believe they obviously have some personality disorders and problems that make them unaware of the impact of their behaviors on others. And if there's antisocial personality, they really don't care about the impact of others, of their behaviors on others.
Antisocial personality disorder is kind of like what might be an urban description for which might be what's sociopathy or
psychopathy or psychopathy, however you want to pronounce it. Yeah, it'd be like the folks who commit crimes and don't care about the consequences.
That's the thing. Like, a lot of people consider, a psychopath is a serial murderer that just goes around chopping people to pieces and that. But that's not what it's about at all, is it? It's about a lack of empathy. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, they lack empathy. They lack an understanding or a care about how their behaviors affect others, and they feel above the law. They feel as if their behaviors are completely justified. And so I think there's a lot of parents, there's a lot of variability in people who alienate their children. I believe that there's that level of pathology where there's people who are very ill and don't understand what they're doing. There's a lot of perpetrators have a lot of trauma from their own past that they haven't resolved. And
that caused it, because one of some cases that I've heard of, the perpetrator has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, for instance. So it can be caused by stress disorders and things like that, rather than it being genetic, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, this is another form of family violence. And when you look at any perpetrator of violence, whether it's domestic violence or, like what we call coercively controlling abuse, which is actually what parental alienating behaviors are. Any perpetrator of violence, if you look to the domestic violence research literature, we find that that is a common trait of perpetrators, that they have unresolved trauma from their own lives that they are living out in their relationships today as adults. This is why we see parental alienation transmitted across different generations, just like we see other kinds of abuse. The parallels are all there. In fact, I wouldn't even call them parallels. We're just using two different terms for the same thing, and we need to stop doing that. We need to have people recognize that what we're talking about is coercively controlling abuse. And when abusers use their children as weapons, we call it parental alienation. It just has a different word for it because we're interested in how it affects children. Whereas a lot of domestic violence researchers stop there. They don't go a step further and look at how it affects children to be used in that way.
And just take you back to something you said there, Jennifer, about people have unresolved issues, and it therefore ends up as a multi-generational disorder. Why do people who have major emotional issues not resolve them?
A lot of reasons. A lot of times they maybe don't have the right types of support and help. Perpetrators of violence often aren't believed, or people overreact and they believe to, like, the people that are working with them don't have the training necessarily to know how to work with them. There could be a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's just very difficult to deal with the pain of a loss or trauma from childhood. It's very painful to do. And so rather than deal with it, they will project it onto everybody else around them. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of motivation to do that. And a lot of people,
it's going to take a lot of work to project it onto all those around you too. And, there are usually implications for, the victims of your projections presumably object, and they've got to deal with all of that. Wouldn't it would seem so much simpler to say, well, look, there's something not right here. I better go and talk to somebody and get it fixed. But is it the case that we still have a social stigma around mental health, which prevents people wanting to go and get help? Or is it simply that the personality disorder is so entrenched that they don't know they should go and get help?
A combination of both. I think you're describing kind of two forces that are operating at the same time on people. A lot of abusers in general fail to take responsibility for their behaviors. And, there could be a lot of reasons for that. There could be, maybe not acknowledging or understanding the impact that they're having. It could be that combined with, not, there's probably a lot of, for some people, maybe even guilt about what they've done and failure to acknowledge that. But that would entail some level of empathy. And a lot of really abusive people lack that. And so I think for the mild alienators, or people who don't engage in really severe abuse, there's more chance of them changing. But the people who engage in much more severe abuse, we know that domestic violence batterers, for example, people who engage in very severe physical abuse, it's very difficult to get them to change. Like we know from the intervention literature, it's very challenging to get those behaviors to stop. It takes a lot of intensive work, and the programs that exist right now aren't fantastic. The outcomes, we know that the success rates are very low, and so it's not surprising that we would not see much success working with very severely alienating parents. Because
you're going to tell us how we're going to achieve that.
No. No.
Look, I think at this stage, I know you have a presentation ready for us, Jennifer. So if I could perhaps hand over to you and ask you to introduce Luke at the appropriate time, and Crack on with your speech. Hi, Luke, you're very, very welcome. And just to draw to our viewers' attention, the questions box is there. If you have questions for Jennifer, we've received some hundreds of them already. We're going to pose them to Jennifer at the end of her presentation, and you can file any new ones there under questions. But for now, Jennifer, over to you.
Okay. All right. Now, I didn't prepare any sort of really formal like talk or presentation. I thought I would just sort of describe the intervention study that my graduate student, Luke Saunders, who's here today, you can see him, that he and I worked on. And then, I'd like to open it up to answer a lot of questions because I kind of just want to be more of a resource for you all. And I've published a lot of papers over the last few years, and I think I've published 4 just this year alone, so I can answer questions on those as well. So we, Luke and I, and Dr. Tamara Afifi from the University of Santa Barbara, or University of California, Santa Barbara, we published a paper, I guess, Luke, when did it come out? Just a couple weeks ago. Yeah, we had been asked by Linda Gottlieb to help evaluate her program. Now, I've done a lot of program evaluations in the past for different types of local and even national interventions for other types of health behaviors. And so I agreed to help do the evaluation for her independent, because she wanted it to be done independently. Because so far, the publications, the evaluations that have been done on other interventions for severely alienated children were conducted by the people who had been somewhat involved in those programs. So for example, the Family Reflections Program was evaluated by Dr. Kathleen Rie, who was also one of the person who developed the program. And Dr. Rick Warshak, he published 2 outcome studies for the Family Bridges Program, which is another one, that one of the original, the first program designed for severely alienated children. And he had initially been involved with helping to create the program along with Dr. Randy Rand, but then he stepped back and because he wanted to be more objective in his evaluation work. But he was still criticized for being involved in that, even though I think that criticism was misplaced. So Linda wanted to have somebody outside, an objective kind of third party, evaluate the Turning Points for Families program, which if you read our paper, and I'm happy to share it if anyone wants to email Luke or myself after this, we're happy to share a copy of the paper. I can't publicly post it because there's copyright issues. But you'll see in the description of the intervention, it has a lot of similar elements as the other programs designed for severely alienated children. There's psychoeducation components. There's a strong court order that's used to order the program, restrict contact with the abusive parent. I'm calling alienators abusive parents because in these cases, the court had recognized that child abuse is parental alienation is child psychological abuse. And so there's a restriction of contact during the reunification period, during which time the alienating parent needs to get support and help to help stop the behaviors. And then the child's protected from those during that period of time. And then they're involved with the program. Now, there's a critic of parental alienation who's essentially what I would characterize as a false expert. Her name's Jean Mercer, and she's published openly criticisms of intervention programs about alienation. And her work is not published in very highly regarded scientific journals. In fact, they're practice journals that are almost not even on the radar for what's considered quality research or publications or opinions. But she in the past has said that these interventions for children are traumatic, and that taking children away from an alienating parent, mind you, an abusive parent, is traumatic. even though we know child protection services does it all the time when there's physical abuse, sexual abuse, or other things. No one says, oh, it's going to be traumatic to take them away from their abuser, because there's a recognition that the abuse that they are undergoing is worse than the separation that they're going to have to experience temporarily while that parent gets help. And so all of these programs that are designed for severely alienated children have these components where you protect the child from those behaviors. And Turning Points for Families was no different. But the biggest question is, is this traumatic? We wanted to address that with our evaluation of the Turning Points for Families program, because Linda Gottlieb is, it's a great program. I mean, it's very difficult work to do, to work with very severely alienated children and their families. But the challenge is, a lot of practitioners don't have research skills, and they don't design their programs with an evaluation component in mind, where they're going to look at it and say, here's, what the families were like beforehand, here's what happened afterwards, and then they track it, and they don't use measures, they don't use a lot of the tools that as a researcher we use when we evaluate programs. So that made it a challenge for Luke and I to evaluate the program, because how do you show it's effective? How do you show it is working without measures or surveys or instruments that you can track change over time? But one thing that Linda had were videos of all the interventions that she's done, which is just like sitting in an office, like you're like a bird in an office or you're a fly on the wall who can observe what is happening in the interventions, which is amazing. That's amazing data. So you can actually see what is going on throughout the intervention to see, are these kids being traumatized? Like, is this just torture for what they're experiencing? Like what Jean Mercer wrote about, that this is horrible. These kids are subjected to this terrible weekend where they're forced to do all these horrible things and they're traumatized because of it. So we had the videos. And so that is what we used to evaluate the program. And now, because I do a lot of research on parental alienation, one thing that, even though I was never involved with the program myself, I didn't design it, I'm not involved with the treatment. Obviously, our critics of parental alienation would still say that I would be biased because I do research on parental alienation, even though no one holds other domestic violence researchers up to that same criticism when they evaluate other people's work. So in order to mitigate that kind of criticism, I asked Luke, my graduate student, who I will have him introduce himself here in a second, be involved with the analysis of the data. And then Dr. Tamara Afifi, who, as I mentioned, she's at University of California in Santa Barbara. And she is a communications professor who has for years studied nonverbal and verbal communication. And I asked her to collaborate with us because she had published a few years ago a paper on loyalty conflicts with parents, which is a different type of family conflict, right? This is where both parents just don't get along very well. Even after divorce, they're still fighting and the kids are stuck in the middle. But it's not alienation, right? It's more where you just have two parents who still just can't get along very well and the kid is triangulated and stuck, right? And that's a different dynamic. And in her papers, she videotaped interviews with them, and she and her team had coded these videos, so they looked for specific types of communication patterns within those videos to see how the conflict of the parents was affecting children. And so based on her research, I wanted to collaborate with her on these videos that Linda had for all of her interventions. And she was very happy and excited to work with us on this because she doesn't publish in this area at all. She doesn't know much about alienation. And then she and her research team then pulled together, we got permission from the parents who were part of the program to use the videos and share them with the research team. And then they reviewed all of them, and they tracked and they coded in the videos 3 different dimensions of what was happening in the intervention. One of them was relational communication. Another one was social support. So how much people were showing support for each other. And then the last one was communal coping. And those would be indications such as saying that, hey, we're in this together. We're going to work through this together. We're going to get through this and whatnot. And so the idea here is if it's so traumatizing, you would see decreases in those things, right? So if there was relational communication problems or social support or communal coping, that those things will get worse the more those kids are with this parent who, in many cases, hadn't seen the alienated parent in several years. So these were not just mildly or moderately alienated children. These were children who were very severely alienated, hadn't seen or spoken to this parent in years, and had 80% of them traveled with that parent to the intervention. And so these interventions were done in the United States on Long Island, which is outside of New York City. And these families traveled with the children, or the parents traveled with the children after the court order went in. And which is a miracle in and of itself, because these are children who were threatening to kill themselves, who were threatening to run away, who were, told police that they never wanted to see them again and that they were, destroying property. I mean, the things that these children were saying about not wanting to see the alienated parent miraculously didn't happen when the court order came in, and then they went on the intervention and traveled with the parent across the country to the intervention. Now, 20% or so did, and Luke, you can correct me if I'm wrong because I don't have the paper in front of me, but about 20% did travel with the alienating parent to the site, and then they transferred and they exchanged custody there. And in those cases, just like the other ones, once the children were in the care of the alienated parent, their communication and signs of communication and support for each other improved. And so then what we found is that at the start of the intervention, all the way to the end, which is a 4-day intervention, that the rates of all the indicators were already above average. And Luke, maybe you can chime in here because he helped do the analysis piece of this part. So,
yeah, sure. We took the coding that Tamara or Fifi did, and basically we were just looking at how those measures changed over time for all the participants. And basically, I just built a model to do this. And what it ended up finding is that there were no significant negative changes on any measure. So, contrary to the criticism, you would expect to see those measures go down, but actually none of them had any significant negative changes. And actually the highest improvement was communal coping, that measure of communal coping, and we saw a pretty significant positive change on that. So, overall, there were no negative significant changes, and we actually saw improvements in some areas. So, from this sort of one study, we can say that it was safe and effective, and hopefully we can do sort of some more studies in the future on these types of interventions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the communal coping increased over time and the other ones remained stable. And so it's a promising intervention. And now granted, the intervention, it has some, any study you do has limitations, right? Any study, any evaluation you do has limitations. You're limited by the data that you can get. We weren't able to get a lot of information other than the videos. We did get court orders, so we could see what some of the details about what the families were like before the intervention, which were strikingly different than what happened when they went through the intervention. And then long term, we did get some indications from Linda Gottlieb about what happened to the families afterwards. Most of them still stayed with the parent. they were able to resume some contact with the alienating parent after the parent had gotten help. But a lot of them were still within the care of the alienated parent. For the children who aged out, meaning that once they reached the age of majority, when they could, they were not held under any court order. In the United States, that's 18. I know in the UK, I think it's a little higher, I think 19 or something. I don't know about in Ireland. But once that happened, some children or young adults did go back to the alienating parent when the court order wasn't applying to them. But the ones that did were ones that had participated in the program when they were a little older. So if the intervention can happen when they were younger, then the effects seem to hold longer, and they're less likely to go back to the alienating parent. But even in those cases, when they went back to the alienating parent, most of them still had some contact with the alienated parent, which is still an improvement from what it was before. It doesn't mean we're going to get perfect results here. I mean, we're talking about the most severe cases, which are the hardest to treat. Ideally, interventions that are done for mild and moderate cases, when done earlier, would be much more effective because we can prevent it from getting so bad that it requires such a dramatic intervention, like restricting contact. You know, even with other types of child abuse, you only do that when it's really bad, right? You would never just put a child in foster care for one minor offense, right? Same thing with alienation. There's a lot of critics out there who claim that people who study parental alienation only argue for transfer of custody. Like that's the only solution, and that is completely untrue. We recognize that this is a form of child abuse that runs a spectrum of severity, and the kind of intervention you do depends upon how severe it is. And so this Turning Points for Families program intervention is designed for severely alienated children. So it's not to be something you would apply to children in the mild or moderate stages. And I'm happy to answer questions about what those are too. But so that's essentially what the paper is. It's a beginning, so it's almost kind of a pilot intervention because Linda Gottlieb's program's really only been operating in the current form for the last, I think maybe 5 or 6 years, Luke. Maybe you can correct me. And because of COVID, they had to do a lot of the interventions remotely, which is interesting. We did not include those in this particular study because we stopped collecting the videos right before COVID started, and interventions had to take place via Zoom. So it would be interesting to see like how those families ended up because of the Zoom intervention. And it might, in fact, Zoom interventions might even make it more affordable for some families because it's very expensive to travel and to take your whole family out for an intervention like that. And so the results really can't be generalized maybe to all families yet because we don't know does it just generalize to families who could afford this type of intervention, who were fortunate to have a court and a judge who were willing to do something about the alienation that the children were experiencing, recognizing that what these children were experiencing was abuse. And so it can't generalize to all cases where if the court doesn't see it as severe and they don't maybe restrict contact with the parent and child for a short period of time, we know that if the parent is not reformed and they're still engaging in behaviors, that the intervention won't work because the child will still be abused. And so they have to be protected from the abusive behavior. So, Luke, do you have anything else you might want to add or some thoughts you have about it after we did the study?
No, I mean, you pretty well covered it. Though, like you said, the data we collected was not anything that the person running the intervention collected. Like they didn't use any measures or anything. So, it kind of was unfortunate that we didn't have like more kind of data or variables or things to look at. Because, like you said, it may vary by age. It may vary by the types of families that are showing up. We just weren't able in this study to look at it, but now that we've kind of done this, like you said, as sort of like a pilot study, maybe future interventions will be able to collect some more data, like extra variables, even just sort of like demographic things, because we didn't have many of those either. Yeah, just different things that we can factor into, how the treatment affects people, and hopefully it's still effective in that case, but just kind of see how that can vary.
Sounds good. Can I just take you back again a little step? So I just wanted to clarify, what was it Linda Gottlieb who actually motivated this research in the first place?
She had been running her program for several years and was constantly asked, well, does it work? Right? Does it work?
Again, I need to stop you there just for the uninitiated. I've come across Linda before, perhaps other people haven't. Linda runs a program out of New York, is it, or Boston, for parentally alienated children in circumstances where change of residence is required for a period of 90 days, where the kids are taken away from the abusing parent and off to the targeted parent, during which they go for therapy of a very specialized nature with Linda. And then Linda asked you to help out on her efficacy, did she?
Yes. Yes, she asked us to assist. And as I mentioned before, the reason I collaborated with Luke and Dr. Afifi is because Dr. Afifi's team, who doesn't do parental alienation research, her team did not know what the program was about. All they were given were the videos, and they coded the videos. And then they gave us the data. Luke analyzed the data. And then I summarized everything and wrote it all up. And so that's what we published. And so,
does it work? Does it work?
Yes. And so far it seems to be effective. One thing I think that, we grapple with is, when the family showed up, okay, so we got the court orders, we reviewed all of them, and you can see that these were very severely alienated children. I mean, meaning they were threatening to kill themselves and run away if they had to see the alienated parent. Then, from day one, when they get to the intervention, they're already above average on their communication with the alienated parent. So the question is, we're left with how much of it is the intervention, and how much of it is simply the court stepping in and saying no more abuse and taking them away from the
and I suppose by implication, the kids at last being given the license to actually love somebody they really want to love anyway.
Exactly. I mean, it's not just that they're transferred custody. The court, the judge will communicate to the children directly why they're doing this. Right? They'll communicate that this is what's going to happen, and here's why. And the children are relieved of the responsibility of having to reject a parent. They have no choice in the matter anymore, because they've been given choices that are not theirs to make. They've been given a burden.
Again, I can't speak for. I can't speak for. We have viewers today from India and Israel and Australia and all around the world. I can't speak for exactly how things work in those jurisdictions, but I know for a fact that in Ireland, there is no intervention program. There is I've never heard of a case where even a parentally alienated child was referred for a change of address, a temporary change of custody by a court. Not to mention being referred off for therapy. And as far as I know, and again, I'm not a lawyer, Jennifer, it is actually not within the power of courts in Ireland to order someone to attend for any kind of psychiatric treatment. So is that different in the States, or how do they circumvent the kind of issues I've just raised?
It's not. So the court can order it, like saying that it's a condition of reunification, right? It doesn't mean that the parent has to comply necessarily. Usually they'll appeal it, or they'll do something else. They can't order a therapist to make the determination that the other parent is ready. right? They can't give the family or a therapist that much authority. And so now I think it varies a lot. And I know that this is an issue in Brazil and in Portugal. So for example, in Brazil,
it's a criminal offense, isn't it?
yeah,
10 years in jail
it's enforceable where they recognize it as abuse, and they can order a parent to go get treatment, much like domestic violence, right? You would order a batterer to attend a 1-year program. So they have the authority to do that. Now in Portugal, which uses a lot of Brazilian jurisprudence, right? They use a lot of their laws or their historical kind of legal cases as a basis of their own, because it's Portuguese, right? They both have to speak the same language. But in Portugal, they don't have the same criminalization, essentially, of it. So they don't have the same authority to order a parent to treatment. And so that's been creating a lot of problems, like Sandra Feder, who's an attorney out of Lisbon. She's written about this a lot. And she says, in Portugal, they don't have the teeth like to enforce things the way that they can in Brazil. And it's similar here in the US, and I'm not an attorney either, but I've seen and been involved in enough cases where the court has some authority. I mean, they have authority to intervene when there's domestic violence and protecting children from abuse. They have a lot of authorities in that regard. Or they have a lot of authority in that regard. And similar, they might even sometimes refer the family to a dependent, they might label them as a dependency and neglect case, which has its own courts here in the United States. And so now I'm not sure what would happen in other countries and then other systems. Now, and you don't necessarily have to have the type of intervention that I've been talking about. So turning points for families, family bridges, family reflections, those are all different types of programs with similar, they do things differently, but they have kind of similar elements to them for the families. But you don't have to have a structured intervention like that necessarily if you're going to treat parental alienation. So if you're in a country that has no intervention program, it doesn't mean that you can't still treat the problem. You can have the right type of court order, you can have the right type of family therapy with a practitioner who understands what they're doing. You usually have to do a team approach with these types of cases where you have a person who's appointed to work with the court, who is sort of a liaison to the family and to the therapists who are working with that family. And then you have a family therapist who's working with the alienated children and the parent. And then you have a provider who's working with the alienator. And this point person who's working with the court communicates on their behalf and revises the treatment plan as it goes along. So you don't have to have a weekend intervention. You can have a treatment team who can do this, but unfortunately, you have to kind of have and that's evidence-based. You don't have to even evaluate that. That's based on evidence that we know to be effective in other types of abuse. And I think sometimes people get that confused when people, and I've seen these critics who are of parental alienation say things such as, these programs are evidence-based. And they're using that term incorrectly. When we mean evidence-based, we mean that somebody's developed a program that's based on best known practices for treatment, where there's been evidence that it's worked in other situations or in other contexts, and so it's being used in that particular context there. That's evidence-based. If a program's been evaluated, that obviously provides additional evidence, but it's not necessary to have.
I'm just trying to think of practical application for all of this, rather than going down the academic route too far, because it could be a rabbit hole we'd be going down for a while. Excuse me, Jennifer. The team that you mentioned, the experts, it's starting to sound a little bit like justice for the rich.
Doesn't have to be. Yes, it doesn't have to be. The problem is you have to have providers, even child protection workers, who understand it. If you don't have a child, you need a whole systematic change, right? An institutional reform when you have a child protection system that doesn't recognize parental alienation as another form of child abuse, then they're, missing the boat entirely, and parents aren't getting the support they need. People who don't have providers who get it. And right now it's true, right? Today, you have to have a lot of money to get the right attorney and the right providers to get the services you need. And that's not fair. And that needs to change. And the only way that'll change is if we can get CPS, or what we call them CPS, but other, you might have different words for the child protection services.
Child protection services, TUSLA, or whoever your local.
Right.
Yeah,
and start recognizing it as child abuse. And the problem is, even here in
just on that one, though, Jennifer, because you've already told us that there is resistance. You mentioned Jean Mercer and people like that. There are people who are resistant to the whole concept of parental alienation, not just those specific words, but they actually claim no, parental alienation does not exist. It's a bit like saying, sorry, murder doesn't exist. How do they possibly justify it, and what is their motivation for such nonsensical arguments?
I can't speak to their motivation. I can only guess about their motivation, but I can at least say that a lot of the beliefs, the constant underlying belief, is tied to a gender paradigm about violence, meaning that the folks who are pushing that idea believe that men are abusive and women are not abusive. They only use aggression in self-defense. That's the underlying belief. If you boil it all down, and I've been trying to boil it down for many years, and that's what it's boiled down to. It's seen in the rhetoric, the statements that are made by people such as Joan Meyer, Jean Mercer, Adrienne Burnett, this constant repetitive argument that men are abusive, women and children need to be protected from them, men cannot be victims, women are only protecting their children. And it goes against the scientific evidence and research on abuse and what we know, and national statistics on what abuse is. It also
goes against the fact that, many of the targeted parents in our experience are women. Like, men do this to women. It's
I know it completely undermines. And I take, I guess, personal offense to it too, because if somebody, for example, is making a claim of abuse, of domestic violence, for example, to alienate their children, which doesn't happen in the majority of cases. It actually happens probably in about half. Okay, maybe a little bit less than half. There's a false allegation of abuse. And I'm a victim of domestic violence myself. And it upsets me when people make up things like that, because it undermines protections for people who really were abused. Right. And for mothers and fathers who've been victims of domestic violence and have their children used as weapons against them, it's telling, for example, mothers that their experience is not alienation, that their experience is just because they had an abusive ex-husband. Fathers, that sends a message that they are not victims, that they're actually the abusers, and that they're just as responsible for what's happening to them, which is not true either. So that arguing and that position that's being taken by the critics of alienation is completely undermining protections and validation for people's experience.
And just, what do you mind me prying a tiny bit? Was the abuse that you suffered a psychological form of abuse as well?
Both psychological and physical, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you know about it from both sides of the fence then as well. In terms of the gosh, it's just such a traumatic subject, isn't it? It's so painful. But but you mentioned a few other people there, Burnett, Adrienne Burnett, and people like that, who I know has had a big influence on the Parliament in the UK. Where one of the MPs was trying to have parental alienation looked at in the House of Lords and failed, largely because of papers presented. I believe Adrienne Burnett was one of the main protagonists. why did she want to shoot down a fellow woman who was arguing to have, I mean, she was a victim herself, Baroness Mayer, of parental alienation, and her, as she said herself, her husband left, went to Germany, wouldn't let her see her kids. And whilst she does have some relationship with her kids now, in her own words, had she been around when they were growing up, they would be different people. I mean, it is such an intrinsic part of who we are as a species to bring up your children in, whatever your creed, religious belief. It is a fundamental, natural inclination of every living being to procreate. And it is basically the only thing we really know we're here to do. So when the ability to mold your procreation in any way, shape, or form to help make the world a better place or give some meaning to your life is removed from you, it's got to be something. I'm thinking about Baroness Mayer here when she says things like her own kids would be different people. I mean, that's really, really tough on the person. And what you were saying earlier about the pain that the victims go through, you can kind of understand why it would lead someone to suicide.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in a paper I published about 2 years ago, we found that of the parents who were moderately to severely alienated from their children, almost half had thought of killing themselves in the last year. And Mandy Mathewson and her colleagues found that in their sample, 23% of their sample had tried to kill themselves. And so this isn't a trivial experience. And in fact, even in the last 2 years, there's been several papers published on the experiences of targeted parents. That it's not just, we talk about the loss of the child and it's not just post-traumatic stress, it's continuous traumatic stress. It's not like you experience something in the past and you keep reliving.
You're still in the war zone, you're still getting shot at.
Yeah, all the time, all the time. You get a call and you don't know who it is, and then it's the police, or it's something always triggering you, and you're always on defense, you're always walking on eggshells. And that's the same experience of parents who are in a violent relationship, always walking on eggshells. Just because the relationship ended now, because you have a child together, sadly, it's continuing. And that child is being used. And you were right in the beginning to say that we don't find gender differences in who is a victim of this, just like there are not gender differences in national statistics on who's a victim of other types of violence.
So on that point then, why is it that it seems that misandry is afoot here and not misogyny?
I think, I have a couple theories. I don't know. I have opinions on it. I can't say for sure. I think there's a lot of money tied to this, in my opinion. Maybe Luke, you're an outsider, relative outsider to this, which is why he actually is working in my lab, because I like to have diversity of opinions in my lab. But maybe he can chime in too on some of his thoughts on this.
Would you agree with that? Would you agree with that last one, Luke, that there may be a gravy train involved here?
Oh, absolutely. But I've mostly looked at it and talked about it with Jen in like the US, but in terms of like some of the kind of like laws that they're trying to push in state legislatures and even like the national legislature, there's definitely money behind it. So
yeah. And I seriously think that sometimes, that the only way we can really combat this, I mean, we have lots of person power. We have lots of motivated, passionate people who want to get behind this. But it is a David and Goliath type thing where there's a lot of money on the other side. And we need like a tobacco lobby. That's what we need. We need money. We need an international firm who can lobby and help us. And I think we're all tapped out. We're all broke. We've been fighting our cases in court. We're all, we've been spending all our money on trying to see our children. And that is a symptom of abuse, right? Financial abuse. A lot of us, most of it is beaten down and we don't have the resources anymore. And the people in power, in this case, the abusive people in power have a vested interest in maintaining that.
So are you
And
suggesting that the legislators, for instance, themselves are perhaps somewhat narcissistic and therefore prone to parental alienation as a form of coercive control of their spouses, and therefore they don't want parental alienation to be voiced publicly?
I don't know. I don't know if I would put it on the legislators. I put it on the advocates, and I put it on the parents who are involved in those advocacy groups that are getting all the money, and they are pressuring and fooling the people who are making decisions. So, for example,
who's giving them the money, Jennifer?
There's a lot of domestic violence aid.
Yeah,
there's a lot of money, and it's been documented all over. You know, the UK, Netherlands, the US, Canada. People have been trying to follow the money, which is not that you think it'd be easy to do because it's federal money usually, but it's not that easy to find. But people have been investigating it and tracking down the money and finding a lot of suspicious activity. I don't have time to go into all of that, but that could be another show.
We have heard about money being an issue in the past, Jennifer, but it was primarily at a legal level where, you know, barristers and solicitors and attorneys, as you call them, were making so much money out of fighting these cases and having people who were absolute loggerheads with each other, that if things were resolved, the money wouldn't be there, and right. That the judges were themselves barristers and solicitors before they became judges, and they know exactly how the system works and how people's bread gets buttered, and therefore they propagate it when they get into power as well. But when you know, if that is the case, that means that our courts around the world are responsible for the propagation of child abuse.
I agree with that. My book that I published back in 2016, that's one of we talk about the institutional contributions to alienation, and institutions very much so are involved with this. And they get funding for it, right? Just yesterday, Dr. Bill Burnett's, or 2 days ago, Dr. William Burnett's published a paper on the misinformation and disinformation that's being spread about parental alienation and tracking down where it comes from. And there are frequent offenders who constantly keep pushing it. Joan Meyer being one of them, Jean Mercer being one of them. There's several associations that do it as well, like APSAC, the Association for the, oh God, I'm going to get it wrong. That's child abuse, essentially. They constantly misquote parental alienation. There's several institutions that support this. There is money to be made, but I think you got to also look at all the levels in which this operates. You know, there's many, many levels, not just the court level. And I know it's easy for people to focus just on that because that's where your cases are. Right.
The psychologists who support the courts, presumably, you know, the court appoints a psychologist to go and examine the situation and come back and present to the court an opinion. If that opinion comes back as one that the court clearly does not want to receive, that person is unlikely to get any more business, and therefore they might learn fairly quickly to tell the court what it is the court does want to hear. So I can see how it looks bad, but I am keen. I'm keen because we've just hit the 1 hour mark now, Jennifer, and you did say you wanted to take some questions. So with your permission, I'll be guided by some of the viewers at this stage and see the kind of things that they want the answers to. Pardon me 1 second. Can we have the sources for the studies Jennifer mentions on thoughts of suicide of alienated parents? That's something maybe they could find on your website. Have you got that sort of stuff available on the website, Jennifer?
There's my paper, which was published in 2019. Harman, later Elder, and Beringen. I'll write down what these are, and then I'll send them to you, and then the reference.
Okay, we'll put them up on alienated.ie. We have another one here. Why are psychologists and psychiatrists not as a body campaigning against parental alienation? And I don't think that's a rhetorical question, by the way.
Nope. No, I think there's a couple things. A lot of people don't know what they don't know. A lot of clinicians that are in practice now, a lot of them got their training prior to 1985, which is kind of sad. And that's before there's been changes to accreditation of programs, meaning that anybody who gets a PhD in psychology has to have a scientist practitioner kind of approach where they're trained in science. So anybody who got their degree before that, chances are they probably don't understand science. They don't understand how to interpret advances in research. And many practitioners don't have access to the journal articles where research is published. So I just did a review of all the studies that have been published on alienation. We're in the process of, it's under review right now. But in that, there were over 220 papers that have been published with data on alienation, and almost 40%, or more 30% have been published in the last 4 years. So if you're a practitioner out in the field who doesn't have access to journal articles, and you haven't read anything in the last 4 years, you're really out of date with what we know about parental alienation. So this might explain why, when you have a psychologist you're working with, when they don't get it, chances are it's because they don't know what they don't know.
We have one in here saying that this is very concerning. I'm a psychologist and never expect a court wishes any particular outcome of my assessments. Not a lot of psychologists work in this area, ?
Yeah, it's very hard to work in this area. A lot of psychologists don't even want to touch it. And a lot of the psychologists I work with they're passionate about it for reasons that, good reasons, but they burn out. I mean, every time I get emails all the time from parents saying, I need a provider. I need somebody who gets this. And I don't know who to refer them to because so few people understand it. And those that do get it are inundated and they're overwhelmed and they burn out. And that needs to change. And they need protections too, because you got to realize that if a provider does get it and it's an alienation case, what's the other parent going to do? What's the alienator going to do? They're going to complain. They're going to file reports against them. They're going to complain about them because they don't believe that they've alienated their children. They believe they've been protecting their children and that they're totally justified. So these psychologists and professionals deal with complaints all the time. So I understand why a lot of professionals don't want to do this, because it is really hard work. That's why I don't do practice. I do research, and even that is like I am attacked all the time. And the providers I know who work in this area are attacked even more than I am. And so when they go to court, I mean, it's true that courts don't necessarily they're not looking for a particular outcome. However, there are a lot of efforts right now, even in the EU, to make it where you can't even talk about parental alienation in court. They're trying to make it where you can't even introduce scientific evidence about it, because they realize that the scientific evidence is there, and the same advocates who are pushing for anti-parental alienation work, they're trying to push legislation to make it where you can't even argue it in court when it's affecting you. And that's very concerning. I think it should be concerning to all your viewers here that that is what's happening.
We have questions also, and I know it's part of the schedule for today, Jennifer, on the area of shared parenting. You mentioned earlier that, we discussed the motivation for your current research was the transfer of custody scenario that Scott Lieb works around. But shared parenting is also something that might be considered as an alternative. Can we Can we just move a little bit on into that area, and perhaps you could share with us some of your experiences in the shared parenting area in terms of what might work and what doesn't?
Yes, in fact, Luke and I just published, he was the lead author on it, a paper looking at shared parenting and the law in Greece, because there was a new law that just went into effect this month there on shared parenting. Now, shared parenting, it doesn't mean it's equal parenting, because sometimes parents' schedules can't always accommodate an equal 50-50 type thing. And some parents don't want that. Some parents, they would rather not have that. But when there's a presumption of shared parenting from the beginning, when people get divorced, they find that usually that alleviates a lot of stressors around, the need to go and try to prove the other parent is horrible. Right? Oh, I need to show that they're dangerous or unsafe so that I can get custody of my children. And it takes some of those kind of fears away, because getting divorced is really obviously anxiety producing, right? And it creates a lot of conflict. And in many families, that conflict finally drops after the divorce. But with alienation cases, oftentimes it doesn't. And if a parent gets primary custody, they will often abuse that privilege, right? They will abuse that time. They will use that opportunity to further harm their children. And so in some ways, the shared parenting arrangement can help. We don't have a lot of data on this yet, but we do know from the scientific evidence so far, we do know that more time with the parent can help mitigate the effects of alienation. So no matter how much a parent might be engaging in behaviors that are trying to undermine a relationship, if the child has quality time with the other parent, it can help. It can help.
The child is not going to get time with the other parent in circumstances where the child is alienated. And if the judge says, right, would you like more time with the target parent, they're going to say, oh, no, I want to stay with right, dad, or I want to stay with mom. I'm perfectly happy. Don't change anything. And right, the judge is going to say, well, there you go. Fait accompli.
Right. Yep. So I'm going backwards. So you're fast forwarded. I'm talking right at the divorce. If they can say, all right, preserve quality time. But yes, once the child becomes alienated, meaning the child has been abused, right? The child has been manipulated. Then they're going to say, yeah, I don't want to spend time with that parent. I hate them. I hate going over there. They give all their trivial reasons for it, or they throw out an excuse as to why they don't want to go over there. Then the court will say, well, the child doesn't want to, we're not going to force them, right? And this is where, when we talk about kind of transfer of custody, obviously you would only do that when you've exhausted other mitigation attempts to try to stop the alienation and the abuse. And then in that case, obviously it's child abuse. You would not have a shared parenting arrangement. You would not have an arrangement like that, because that would be an example of another type of abuse that would go against, it would be a rebuttable presumption, right? So you would rebut that presumption. You would say this child is being abused because they're being alienated. And so in that case, you would not have a shared parenting arrangement. You would put the child with the parent who's not abusing them, right? Now there was an issue with the Greek law, and maybe Luke, you can chime in on this since you led that paper, but even though they passed a law about shared parenting, they excluded language about parental alienation in it. However, they did include language. They didn't say alienation, but they did talk about how a parent should not be undermining a relationship with the other parent, which is, they didn't give it a label, but they described the behavior, right? And Luke, do you want to say anything about that, about some of the limitations of that law?
Yeah, so, it adds that sort of presumption of shared parenting, which is like a really good step. But you mentioned one issue with that kind of law, and also one of the other issues we kind of found with that law is that so even though it's that presumption of shared parenting, there will only be one custodial parent, and in some cases that custodial parent could end up being the alienating parent, which would obviously be a really big issue, and that the change of custodial parent has to be agreed on by both parents in order for it to change. So obviously, if there's alienation going on, that's pretty unlikely. I'm sure that can still be changed somehow. They may have changed, like amended the law a little bit or added some different language, but otherwise not exactly sure how that would work, but that was kind of another major issue that we found with that law as it kind of relates to alienation.
Thank you, Luke. So how can shared parenting be introduced in a scenario where parental alienation is already in existence as a remedy?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be a remedy because, you know, you want to increase quality time. So in mild or moderate cases of alienation, in that situation, the more quality time with the alienated parent, the better, right? Or the parent that's being excluded. Even though the alienating behaviors would still be going on in the background, if the right intervention was done using best practices, the alienating parent would be sort of under surveillance by the court and other providers. And if they continue to engage in behaviors, their time would become restricted, just like any other abusive parent. And then the other parent would start to get more time. So again, if you reframe this and understand this as child abuse, you would treat it like other kinds of child abuse. And if the parent who is engaging in these behaviors keeps doing them, then they would lose their parenting time slowly. And usually the court would say, all right, next offense, you're going to lose weekends. Or
you presume in that it is recognized as child abuse to begin with, and there is a large lobby suggesting that no, it's not. Parental alienation doesn't even exist. And we have a very fair comment here from a legal practitioner who states that we are casting massive aspersions on the courts in the conversation, which have not been their experience. Unfortunately, the courts need to be informed by the psychologists, many of whom will not identify as experts in the area. It's incredibly frustrating as a legal practitioner. And if you are a well-meaning legal practitioner, it is extremely frustrating. It has to be, because your hands are tied. You have a judge who has no rules or regulations or no guidelines to follow. If a judge or a judicial organization from some nation around the world was to contact Dr. Jennifer Harman and say, we want to give our judges some guidelines as to what constitutes abusive parental alienation, as opposed to some very mild version of it, and what should we do about that? What would you say to them?
Well, I do this. I testify in many cases to that very point, and I have educated judges and lawyers. I've educated the Bar Association. I've been asked to give trainings on that. In fact, I've even published a paper with a judge down in Australia on this, and he's emailed me frustrations about being a judge who understands alienation, but not being able to submit orders for cases because the lawyers did not present evidence or scientific evidence to support the right opinion or what he knew was happening. And then if he did, then his cases would be appealed because he introduced things that weren't introduced in court. So I understand the frustrations. It's frustrating for me as a scientist to submit things and have reviewers who don't understand alienation. It's frustrating as a practitioner to work with families where the other people working in the families don't get it. I work with attorneys who understand it and are frustrated because the cases were so messed up for years that they've inherited a mess, right? They've inherited something that's almost not fixable. It's frustrating. And there is no one answer to your question about how to stop that. The only thing I can do is educate and do research to help inform it. And so when I've educated courts and I go and testify, I go in as a blind expert, not knowing anything about the case. I describe the scientific evidence about alienation, how it affects children, and best practices for treatment, and then let the court decide whether or not that's actually an issue, providing the judge and courts with the tools to make a determination, just like they could do with any other kind of child abuse. In the paper I published back in 2020 or early 2021 with Dr. Lorandos, we found that in the appellate cases in the United States, almost 30% of cases where alienation was found made no reference to a psychologist or third party. The court decided it on their own that alienation had happened. So you don't need necessarily a psychologist to come in and say, hey, this is what's going on. The court can review the evidence and decide this. And there's, over the last few years, there's been several important publications that provide the tools to do that. The first, the one that summarizes the scientific evidence is the 5-factor model, which was initially published as the 4-factor model by Dr. Amy Baker. One additional factor was added just a few years ago. There's been some great books published that outline what that 5-factor model is. And I recommend any legal professional or mental health professional who's watching today to get the book, Parental Alienation, Science and Law. It's published by, co-edited by Larandos and Burnett. It's published last year. There's fantastic chapters in it on best practices, reviews of the research, and it's modeled on the 5-factor model.
So it's something that might be of use to lawyers as well then?
Yes. Every lawyer I work with, I tell them to buy it and read it and have a basic understanding of it before I work with them.
And just remind us of the name again, for fear we didn't have our pens and papers at the ready like me.
It's called Parental Alienation, Science and Law.
Okay.
You can get it on Amazon.
Right. And you haven't written this book and won't gain financially from it anyway.
I have no royalties. I get no money for this. I have a chapter in it, but I don't get money for that. I don't get money for my publications, just so you know. People who publish scientific journals, we do not get paid for those. So, that book has, there's a fantastic chapter by Dr. Rick Warshak on best practices for treatment for for mild, moderate, and severe. So you can see how different they are for all the levels of alienation. My chapter is on, I co-authored it with Mandy Mathewson, who's from the University of Tasmania. And we talk about what are the alienating behaviors that parents use. And we use actually the power and control wheel from the domestic violence field to map it and show all the abusive behaviors that these parents do when their children are used as weapons. But there's whole sections on law just for attorneys. And there's a whole chapter on experts and what kinds of questions you can ask your experts, how to deal with an expert who doesn't know what they're talking about. So those are great tools. Yeah.
The question that you're continuing to answer very well, thank you, Jennifer, was if you were to be appointed by a country's judiciary to say, well, what should we do to identify this and stop it and whatever. It would seem to me that from what you've just said, number one, we have a problem with the fact that parental alienation is an urban description for a series of pathological disorders that most laymen won't understand, and therefore we term them parental alienation. It would be very helpful if, therefore, we had a universal definition of what parental alienation is and what constitutes parental alienation. And if we had that, such that it could then be a box ticked leading to, do we have the 5-factor model at play here, by way of making a judge suspicious of the fact that child abuse is in fact at play here. They could then, if we had, which we don't, some kind of, as our legal practitioner pointed out, the experts are not easily identified. So there might be something that we could do to say, well, if they had the following qualifications, be it, I don't know, psychiatry, experience of parental alienation, they've read that book that you just told us about and got a certificate and everything that it has to say. And then we could provide them with, or you could provide them with the necessary research to which they could refer for any detailed explanations of anything. Might that be a schematic that could be applied as an international potential solution to something like this, or would that not work for some reason?
Well, first, there is professional consensus on the term parental alienation. In fact, just 2 months ago, there was a paper, not even 2 months ago, I think, yeah, maybe a month and a half ago, Bill Burnett, Dr. William Burnett, Amy Baker, and I think there were 2 other authors. They published a paper showing the professional consensus on terminology regarding family conflict, as including alienation. And it's been, if you look at the scientific publications over the last 5 to 6 years, there is consensus and consistency across how parental alienation has been defined and how parental alienating behaviors have been defined, not just by me, but by the larger scientific community.
This is the 17-factor model, is it, or this?
No. This is, the parental alienation and the terminology is, what is alienation? We're talking about a child, for example, who's rejecting a parent for reasons that are not legitimate, right? And then the alienating behaviors being one of the drivers, the primary driver of those things. And so there is consensus of the paper. I'll forward you the reference.
Is there a published definition like that where the actual words can be referred to internationally and say, well, this is what the professionals around the world say professionally? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
where can we find that?
In many of my publications, I repeat the same definition over and over. In the book I just told you about, that has the definitions in there as well. The book, I'll forward you the reference for the new paper. And in fact, in November, I'm giving a talk along with Bill Burnett, Edward Crook, and Amy Baker at the AFCC conference in Cincinnati. That's the American Family Courts and Conciliation, where we're going to talk about consensus and terminology. And so there has been, I think it's a misnomer, or it's a tactic by the people who deny alienation to say there is no consensus. And if you actually go to see where is there indications that there's no consensus, there's no evidence. I've never seen any evidence to support that argument. Because when you look at the publications on alienation, I think the only thing I see is that sometimes people interpret resistance and refusal of contact as being alienation, and they're not the same thing. You have children who resist contact, but they could resist contact for a lot of reasons. And on that, most professionals agree. I mean, almost all professionals agree that there could be a lot of reasons why a child would resist contact. Parental alienation is one of them. And there's ways using the 5-factor model that I described for you, those that I mentioned to you, that 5-factor model can be used to differentiate those children and to identify why, and there are telltale signs and indications that differentiate them from children who are experiencing loyalty conflicts, who are experiencing estrangement, which is different. Estrangement is when a child is rejecting a parent for legitimate reasons, like abuse or other types of things. And in a paper I just published with Amy Baker this summer and Mandy Mathewson, we actually indicate that estrangement is actually not very common, because most children who are abused don't reject their abuser. They often protect them. They make excuses for them.
Children, is that like Stockholm syndrome kind of thing?
Yeah, if you work in child maltreatment, I even had a graduate student who was a child protection worker for years. And I think she studied alienation, and she tried for years to get them to do a training on alienation, and they refused to do it, which is very sad. Because especially she published many papers with me on alienation, and but they, the children who are being abused, that she found time and again, they want to go back to their abusive parent. They love them. They feel ambivalent towards them. They want to see them even though that person is hurting them, because they're not probably abusive 24 hours a day, right? It's like people who are involved in a domestic violence relationship. There's cycles of abuse. There's honeymoon periods in which things are good. And the victim will often make excuses for the parent. And the spousal victim will make excuses for their batterer. And you'll see alienated children protect the parent who's abusing them. Because again, alienation is just another word for a child who's been a victim of coercively controlling abuse.
And Yeah, and we know how serious it is. There's questions coming in here, quick and rapid. Here's one for you, which you probably won't be able to answer, but just in the hope that you might be able to give some hope. I've been 8 years in the family law courts. Eventually this year, I'm going to redact this a little. I got an order for full transfer of my parentally alienated children. That order has been before 2 judges who have described the matter as urgent and then adjourned proceedings. It is now 4 months since the report was last produced, and I believe because of it, the alienation has only heightened. I'm losing hope. What can I do? What can I do?
I don't know. I'd have to know a lot more details about what resources are available where you're at. One thing what motivates alienators is power and control, right? So just like batterers, if they feel like they're losing control and power, they will engage in more behaviors to regain control and power. And this is why even when you get the best court order, like they finally figure it out, the alienation just intensifies, or the attempted alienation. You'll start to see allegations of abuse go in. You'll see, because they're desperate to get control back. And this is why alienating
How does
behavior.
that person then? I mean, I hear exactly what you're saying there, and I've heard it so many times from other parents saying, he just wants to control me, or she just wants to control me. Should you let them feel like they are in control, maybe?
No, there's never anything you could do to alleviate that person's feelings of insecurity. There's sadly no amount of, if there's a way to do it, I'd love somebody to show me. I've never seen anything. I've seen parents try to bend over backwards to say, oh, okay, well, maybe if I give them this will please them. And then a month later, their kids aren't coming over for visits anymore. And I warn them, I'm like, no, if you give them that, it's not going to make them happy. It's going to just get worse. And I'm not psychic. It's just that's the way the pattern works.
So is there anything that parents do which doesn't make it worse? I mean, if they resist, then they suffer the wrath. If they don't resist, then they suffer the conceit.
It's a no-win. It's a no-win situation. The best you can do, I mean, and I probably the reason you left the relationship is because it was abusive on some level, right? And it's good to leave a relationship that's abusive. And a lot of people don't leave because they have children and they don't want to leave them in that environment, right? And their worst fears come true when they leave, and then their kids are turned against them, because that's usually what abusive people threaten. They threaten that if you leave, you won't see your children again. If you leave, you're never gonna talk to them again. And they hold true to those promises, or they attempt to. And so when you're dealing with an abusive person, the best thing you can do is protect yourself, right? And find ways to protect your children, which is the hardest thing to do as a parent. You have to protect yourself first, and stay healthy. Because if and when your children are able to get out of that, you need to be healthy. I've seen cases where the courts finally figure out what's going on and they decide that they're going to do something about it. And the alienated parent is so traumatized that they are not in a position to accept their children back.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my number one thing is I know it's impossible and the odds seem informidable. And, the most important thing is get support, get help. It is probably the most traumatic type of thing you can live through. I get it. I mean, it's awful. I get, I can't even tell you how many emails I get with just the worst stories. And I've lived it. My husband's lived it. My current husband. I know what it's like. It's awful. And but the only thing you can do is stay as healthy as you can and hold yourself together and get protections. And if you can't get it, it's hard when you get a court that's not getting it. And I don't have advice for that. I'm not an attorney. I don't know the specifics, but you got to get support and stay as healthy as you can. Because if your child, believe me, your child still underneath does love you. It's just been buried.
That's the hope that writer is looking for, isn't it? Is that somewhere, they're 8 years now battling for the kids' love to try and parent their own child. But what you've just said there is the hope. If they can believe that underneath the facade of "I hate you, mom," or "I hate you, dad," that kid actually does love the parent and is just voicing an opinion that it has no choice but to voice and is not its own. I suppose the big question is then, at what point, when all of the systems have failed, will the child decide of their own merit that they want to end the parental alienation? Is there a typical age that happens?
Dr. Amy Baker has done a bit of work on this, and she has some good resources for parents on how to reconnect with an adult who was alienated as a child. So I would recommend looking at her website and seeing what resources she has there. And not all, you hope that the child will figure it out. You can't guarantee that they will. And that's probably the worst advice I think some parents always get, is they'll figure it out. And that's not, that's not the way it often works. Sometimes parents will figure it out, or children will figure it out after they have children of their own. I've had a lot of alienated parents reach out to me and say, I'm being alienated from my children, and I realize now that I had been alienated from my parent. Because again, it's intergenerational, and they don't realize it till after they've lived it again. Other times children will, when they get older, 18, 19, and they move away from the influence of that parent, they might have a significant other who kind of challenges them on some of their beliefs. And, they have other people in their life who kind of help them see the world differently and see that parent differently. It doesn't take away the loss or the time that you lose with that parent, right? All those lost years of time. But I've even seen the most intractable cases where kids just want nothing to do with that parent, turn around. The evaluation that Luke and I did on the Turning Points for Families program, those were families that the court everybody had kind of said there was no hope for anymore. And all of them, once that court order went in, those kids went to that intervention and they were fine once they were protected from that abuse. So I think that's the important thing, is it's easy to uncover those feelings again when the child is in a safe place.
In closing, Jennifer, because we're just out of time, would it be fair to say that the kids intrinsically have the love in there? Maybe one of the conclusions I might draw from what you've said is that you just have to try and keep yourself rational and, as you say, healthy, and I presume you mean mentally as well as physically there, so that the kids can see, regardless of what they're being told, that my alienated parent deeply loves me, regardless of anything I hear to the contrary. That if that happens, there's a good chance that child will end up reunited with the parent.
There's a better chance, yes. Better chance. And the child needs some role model of sanity. They need a secure base, even though they're not accessing it. A lot of adults who are alienated as children, when they talk about their experience, they know that that parent is there, and that helps them know that, like, it helps them get through it. When they know that they are there, if they know that they're falling apart and all this other stuff, it almost adds to their clinging on to their abuser, because they definitely know they have nowhere to go. If you can hold it together. The children obviously are, when they're brainwashed, the children are they're like anybody in a cult, right? They're viewing things from this framework, and it takes a long time for even adults to look back and change the way that they view their childhood. it takes a lot of work to do that. No matter what the type of abuse you experienced, it's painful to relive. And a lot of alienated children that reunite with a parent, they don't want to talk about it. They just want to experience being together again. They want to not think about the past anymore. And a lot of alienated parents want to go and talk about that, right? They want to go back and relive it and explain themselves. But I've heard from a lot of alienated children that that's not what they want to do. They just want to experience being in a relationship again and not relive it.
So if your kid does come back to you, then don't talk about the past. Don't mention the war.
Right. Unless they bring it up. Say, I'm happy to talk about it. But, just like in any other kinds of marital counseling, don't bring up the past unless it's relevant. If you start bringing in the kitchen sink and, a lot of times it's working with where the person is and what they're ready for. And, sometimes parents will get counseling and, with the adult children and to kind of work out some of those things. But, and the children may want to do that. But again, try not to push your own agenda. Try to be understanding of that your child has been through severe abuse and that you're there for them and you love them no matter what. And it's not easy to do. A lot of parents have to draw the line because the children are so abusive towards them because they've been weaponized so bad, right? And parents just have to say, I draw a line here because I will not let you treat me this way. And that's hard to do as a parent, but it's also important to be a role model to say this behavior is not acceptable. You would not treat your teacher this way. You should definitely not treat a parent this way. And that's really difficult, but it's something that, for your own sanity and your own health, it's an important message to send to children too, if it's really bad like that.
It's a fascinating hour and a half, and it's gone on a little bit more, I'm afraid. Jennifer, thank you for staying.
I can talk all day. We can do this all day.
It really is mind-bending stuff, but I think that you have given some great hope to people out there, some great advice to our professionals viewing this. You have your own website that they can refer to for academic documents. What's the URL for that one, please?
You could look to my personal website. I post synopses of my research as I publish it. It's jenniferjillharman.com. I think I saw it come up in the chat. Another great resource is, if you're not familiar with the Parental Alienation Study Group, which is pasg.info. On there's annotated bibliographies of scientific research, of books that have been published by professionals. And so you can see and stay up to date on research, and they publish a newsletter for members. Membership is free. And there's a newsletter on recent things that are happening. And so you can stay up to date on that. It is an international organization, so it's not just US. We have members from, I don't even know how many countries at this point, like 70. And so I think it's a great resource to get up to date and stay up to date on information.
Okay, so pasg.info and JENNIFERJILL Harman.com, I see.
Yeah.
We'll put those two up on alienated.ie as well. Luke, you've been extremely patient, and thank you for your support of our conversation today, in your patience mostly, but for your input as well. Dr. Jennifer Harman, it's been an absolute pleasure. On behalf of Alienated Children First, may I thank you from the depths of our heart.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.